The night my son married Mara, she raised a crystal flute and called me poor in front of 200 people, and I let her because I needed them to believe it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Her words struck harder than a slap. My ears rang, heat climbed up the back of my neck, and my jaw clenched so tight I felt the enamel ache. My chest went hollow, as if the air had been knocked out of me. For a second, I thought I might collapse right there beside the cake table. The laughter didn't help. It spread across the room like a brush fire, bright and ugly. I stood in my old navy suit. The one Grace had once said made me look like I belonged to another era, and I pressed my palm against my thigh to keep my hand from shaking. That suit had seen boardrooms, funerals, and now this wedding where my worth had been stripped down to a punchline. The jazz trio in the corner had just finished at last. Their instruments hung in the air like held breath. I had the $48,920 banquet invoice folded flat in my inside pocket, paid in full 2 days earlier. I could feel its weight against my ribs like armor no one else could see. Mara tilted her glass, smirking. We're starting our marriage debt-free, which is good because someone isn't exactly Mr. Deep Pockets. Her bridesmaids squealed. From a nearby table, I heard one lean to another and whisper, "Gold digger but smart." The words weren't meant for me, but they carved deeper than the toast. I looked at my son Caleb. He kissed her cheek and held her close. But his jaw flexed, the same twitch I remembered from his little league days when an umpire robbed him of a strike. That tiny tell was the first breadcrumb that told me he knew the joke wasn't harmless. Still, I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I just stared at the ring, a cushion-cut diamond that caught the chandeliers like a net. The appraisal at home said $46,500 issued in my name. I bought it quietly because Grace, before she passed, left me a note in her cedar chest. When love is real, give Caleb a start. Don't make a show of it. Keep the promises. So I gave without fanfare, paid for the wedding, bought the ring, kept my fortune silent. I wanted to see them unmasked. But humiliation has a smell. It's metallic, like coins held too long in a sweaty palm. That night I breathed it in while the room clinked and laughed around me. By midnight the trio was gone, replaced by a DJ who made the floor thump under my shoes. At 12:50 a.m. I walked the room one last time like I would a job site, scanning for what others missed. That's when I found it, a crumpled florist bill tucked under a napkin at the buffet. It read, "Emergency peonies, substitution, total $2,800, with a hurried thank you scrawled across the bottom. I smoothed it flat and slid it into my pocket beside the banquet invoice. On my way to the exit, I passed the service hallway and froze. Voices. Mara Sip's bright tone turned low and sharp, and another woman Sip's voice, older, lacquered, steady. "He Sip's house rich, not cash rich," the woman said. "Give it 6 months." Mara laughed. "Mom." That was my first introduction to Delia, her mother. Not in person, but in motive. By 1:17 a.m., I'd collected the empty envelopes and the seating chart with cell numbers scribbled in pencil. I told myself they were nothing, just scraps. But I knew better. Scraps are where the truth hides. Driving home through Atlanta's thick June air, heat lightning cracked without thunder, the kind that warns without shouting. My old truck hummed at 40 miles per hour, the speed I use when I need to think. Grace's words came back to me. Money doesn't change people, it unmasks them. At home, the deadbolt stuck for a second before turning. I made a note of it. Habits like that keep you alive in other ways. I laid the invoices on the kitchen table under the little ceramic dish where Grace used to keep dominoes for nieces and nephews. Then I pulled out the yellow legal pad, wrote the date at the top, and scrawled one sentence. Keep the mask on them. Below it, I drew 4 columns. Date, amount, what, why. First entries. June 17th, $48,920. Banquet balance, paid in full. June 17th, $2,800. Emergency peonies, found crumpled, paid, verify vendor. March 3rd, $46,500. Ring appraisal, binder no public thank you. Why Grace's wish. I slipped the pad into a manila folder, sealed it with blue painter's tape, and labeled it June Wedding Evidence. I could have cried that night, but humiliation didn't take tears from me. It took resolve. Shame had carved its place in my jaw, my wrists, the space between my shoulders where every tool I'd ever carried still rests. And so I lay down at 2:31 a.m., with the word poor curled beside me like a stray dog. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to smell. I told myself this. I would stay lawful. I would stay quiet, and I would keep the mask on them until they tore it off themselves. That's how I began my war, with a laugh that wasn't funny, a bill for peonies, and a ledger that would outlast them all. Shame doesn't always show itself in the moment. Sometimes it waits, settling into the corners of your house like dust you don't notice until the sunlight hits it. The week after the wedding, it lived in my kitchen. Coffee tasted like metal. Eggs turned rubber in my mouth. I'd sit at the table, staring at the banquet invoice. I kept unfolded like scripture, knowing I had paid every cent, yet feeling like the poorest man alive. Caleb sent one text, "You were off last night," and then silence. Mara, on the other hand, posted a reel, her twirling in the new condo, captioned, "Starting our life debt-free." The likes poured in. Strangers clapped for the lie while I sat with the truth folded on my table. On June 29th, the front deadbolt jammed hard enough that I had to shoulder it. I called a locksmith. He came at 3:40 p.m., changed the cylinder, left me a receipt with the serial number scrawled across the top. "Old brass wears down," he said. I knew better. Old brass doesn't wear down 3 weeks after being replaced. Still, I thanked him, tucked the invoice into my yellow folder, and wrote in my ledger 6/29. Reiki front lock, $145. Cylinder replaced, verify tamper. That night, my neighbor Mr. Keene knocked on my door carrying pound cake. He's retired now, but he spent 3 decades as a postal inspector. "You look like a man who's been mugged without being touched," he said. I told him about the toast. He listened without blinking. Then he showed me a trick. Put each piece of evidence in an envelope, seal it, sign across the flap, and date it. That way, he said, no one can accuse you of cooking the books. Chain of custody. Learned it chasing mail fraud. I wrote across the flap of the florist bill envelope, June 17th, found after reception, sealed June 29th. My signature looked shaky. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Steady now. This is about patience." On July 1st, a bouquet arrived at my door. Lilies, white roses, lavender. No card, just a tag. Dahlia's Boutique. I stared at it until the water in the vase turned cloudy. When I took the trash out, I saw the wrapping buried under coffee grounds. Dahlia's shop logo stamped in foil. Gifts don't come without hooks. I wrote it in the ledger 7/1, flowers delivered. No card, vendor, Dahlia's Boutique. The house felt smaller that night. The cedar chest in my workshop seemed to breathe against the door. Inside were Grace's letters, the original trust binder, and a Polaroid of Caleb at 10 years old, holding up a lopsided birdhouse. I didn't open it. Some things you only open in daylight. Instead, I walked down to Grant Park, sat under the live oak, and made rules. Rule 1, no illegal tricks, no hacking, no spying beyond what the law allows. Rule 2, no shouting matches. Anger doesn't win in front of judges. Rule 3, everything on paper. Receipts, not rumors. Proof, not pride. I remembered the prenup draft from winter. My attorney, Asha Patel, had emailed me a rider protecting the family trust. Somehow it never made it into the final version Caleb signed. I'd ignored it then, trusting love to be enough. Now I scrolled through the emails again. There it was, trust rider not attached. Consider revisiting. I felt my stomach drop. I typed a text to Asha at 11:47 p.m. Need to review capacities, guardianship risks, and post-nup options. Call soon. My thumb hovered before sending. Once it went out, there'd be no pretending this was just a misunderstanding. I pressed send. I lay awake after midnight, the house humming with refrigerator motors and cicadas through the window. Grace's voice came back to me. Softer than the night. Money unmasks people. And now they were starting to whisper about my mask, too. I added one more note to the ledger before closing it. 7/1. Call to Asha pending. Next step, counsel. The pages rustled like they were waiting for more. Grief had turned into a checklist. Tomorrow I'd put the ledger in motion. The war wouldn't be fought with anger. It would be fought with envelopes, affidavits, and a lawyer who understood timing better than love. The Monday after Independence Day, I walked into Asha Patel's office in Buckhead with the yellow ledger under my arm and the original trust binder tucked under my jacket. The July heat outside made the leather chairs sweat against the back of my shirt. I hadn't seen Asha in months, but the moment I laid the papers on her desk, she raised an eyebrow like she already knew the storm I was dragging in. She flipped the binder open to the spendthrift clause. "You still have full discretion as trustee," she said, tapping the page with her manicured finger. "If anyone whispers guardianship, we'll file prophylactically. But you need a current baseline medical proof of capacity." Her voice was calm, surgical. "And update your durable POA with names you choose. Not your son, not his spouse." I nodded, even though the words lodged like gravel. She slid me a draft of a post-nuptial agreement, written so simply even Caleb would see it wasn't set a trap. "All premarital assets stay separate. Debts don't cross. Offer it as a gift," Asha said, never as a threat. On July 8th, I sat in a paneled office at the bank with Vice President Hector Ruiz. He notarized a statement: "No liens on my home, trust liquid reserves intact." I initialed each page and watched him stamp them, each thump echoing in my chest like a gavel. I wrote it in the ledger: 7/8, affidavit notarized. Bank confirms no liens. By July 12th, I had hired PI Lydia Cho. She specialized in public records and courthouse pulls. Nothing shady. Within 48 hours, she called with a voice as flat as a ruler. "Delia's boutique has 3 vendor liens. Biggest problem, a balloon note. $699,842 due December 20th. I could hear her shuffling papers on the other end. "That's motive, Mr. Whitford. Desperation wrapped in satin." I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the date she'd said. December 20th. I circled it 3 times in red ink on the ledger. 6 months from the wedding. Exactly what Delia had told Mara in that hallway. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept seeing Grace's cedar chest in my mind, as if she was knocking from the inside. On July 15th, I invited Caleb to lunch at the Colonnade, one of Atlanta's old stalwarts, where fried chicken comes on heavy plates and iced tea tastes like it's been brewed since 1927. I slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a letter offering them a modest housewarming check, $50,000 contingent on a simple post-nup. Caleb didn't even open it. "So this is a test," he said, pushing the envelope back. "It SEP's protection," I told him. "For you, for her, for what your mother built." He leaned back, eyes hard. "Mara says, you don't trust us." "I trust character," I said. "That SIP's why I keep receipts." He left the envelope on the table. I paid the bill in cash and tucked the slip into my folder. 7/15, Lunchwall/Caleb, offer refused. That night, the Nest cam on my porch caught a figure in the shadows. The timestamp read 11:38 p.m. The person hesitated at my door, reached toward the handle, then turned and walked away. The next morning, I printed the screenshot and sealed it in an envelope, signed across the flap like Keene had taught me. When I told him about it later, he nodded once. "They sipped circling the gate." "Good. Let them. Just make sure the gate records who knocks." By the 3rd week of July, my yellow ledger had grown thick with dates, amounts. Why? The words didn't feel like notes anymore. They felt like bricks, and every page added another layer to the wall I was building. Quiet, legal, impenetrable. The first trap had been baited. I had the affidavit, the audio, the lien deadlines, and now even the shadow at my door. What I needed next were the words, proof spoken from their own mouths, that would take this from suspicion to certainty. People will confess to microphones they can't see, if you let them keep talking. That thought became my compass the week after Caleb walked away from our lunch without even opening the envelope. On July 20th, I drove across town to their condo for a Sunday brunch. Mara had set the table with croissants, cut fruit, and those tall candles that melt into lace down the sides. She fluttered around, performing hospitality like a stage play. Caleb looked tired, his shoulders rounded, but he smiled as if nothing was wrong. On the counter, I noticed an open pitch deck, Mara's work project, sleek fonts, mock-up campaigns, taglines about scaling visibility. I complimented it. "Looks sharp," I said. She preened instantly. "We'll scale once Mom's Q4 stabilizes," she said, tossing her hair. Caleb glanced away. We ate, and I listened. When Mara laughed about old guys and their pretend wealth, I didn't set bite. I asked casually if they sept like help sketching a budget. "Weddings blow holes in boats," I joked. She smiled, all teeth, and said, "Transparency is healthy." That night, at 11:03 p.m., my phone buzzed with a voice note. It wasn't meant for me. Mara's voice, sharp and hissing, to Delia. "He's revising papers. If we get a capacity letter, we can, you know." My thumb hovered over the play button. Then I saved the file, forwarded it to myself twice, and printed the transcript at dawn, in the ledger. 7/20. Audio note, Mara to Delia. Capacity letter mentioned. Saved plus transcripted. The next morning, I called Asha. By noon, she had prepared a verified petition we could file preemptively, a declaratory finding of capacity, backed by a recent cognitive baseline from my doctor. She also drafted a temporary restraining order template in case anyone tried to interfere with my property. "We won't file unless pushed," she said, "but the bullets are chambered." That week, I visited my PCP on July 22nd. I sat in the waiting room doing a crossword in ink. When the nurse asked me to recall 3 words, apple, penny, window, I repeated them with a smile. The doctor chuckled and signed the form, "Capacity intact." I paid $150 and added the receipt to my ledger. Meanwhile, Lydia dug deeper. She pulled vendor statements from Delia's boutique, 3 suppliers unpaid since April, each owed between $4,000 and $12,000. She faxed me a landlord's late notice, stamped in red, dated July 18th. I clipped them together, sealed them, signed across the flap. Mr. Keene stopped by again. I showed him the flash drive with the audio note and the transcript. He taught me another trick: tape the drive shut in an envelope and sign across the tape itself. "That way," he said, "if anyone opens it, it's obvious." He had the steady hands of a man who once treated envelopes like evidence bags. I could feel the pattern sharpening. Mara and Delia weren't just careless, they were desperate. Desperation makes people sloppy. On July 25th, I drove Caleb to my workshop. The Georgia heat was swampy, sweat dripping into my collar. I wanted him to feel the air of the place where I'd built half my life. I let him choose a tool. He picked a planer, ran his hand along the handle like a boy again. For a moment, I saw the son I raised. But then he shifted. Awkward. "Mara says, you like control," he muttered. "I like doors that lock," I answered, not smiling. He didn't set laugh. That night, I sat with the cedar chest and Grace Sipp's letters. I didn't open them. Instead, I whispered what I would have said if she were sitting beside me. "They sip are circling, Grace, but the paperwork is stronger than their whispers." The ledger page for July grew heavy with ink. 7/20. Brunch. Mara mentions Q4. 7/20. Audio note. Segapacity letter. 7/22. PCP visit. Capacity intact. Receipt $150. 7/22. Petition plus tro drafts from Asha. 7/24. Vendor liens. Landlord notice. Boutique. 7/25. Workshop Baloo/Caleb tool taken. Remark about control. I closed the folder, signed across the flap again, and placed it in the fireproof box under my bed. Not because I thought the house would burn, but because insurance companies don't argue with fireproof boxes. I didn't rage. I didn't confront. I documented. The whispers now had a date, a voice, and a transcript. But words alone wouldn't seal a case. Keys and scratches would. The next act would prove who had their hands on my locks. Money leaves footprints. Keys leave scratches. And both were about to speak louder than anything Mara or Delia could ever say out loud. On the night of August 4th, I came home from the hardware store with a bag of screws and sandpaper. As I slid my key into the front deadbolt, I noticed faint grooves around the cylinder, fresh scratches shining silver against the brass I'd paid to have rekeyed just 5 weeks earlier. I crouched down with the porch light behind me and traced the marks with my thumb. They were too deliberate to be random wear. Someone had tried. I unlocked the door, went straight to the kitchen, and pulled out the June 29th locksmith invoice. The serial number for the new cylinder was still scrawled in black ink. I snapped a photo of the plate, dated it in the ledger 8 quarters. Scratches on rekeyed lock, photographed, verify tamper. That night, at 2:14 a.m., the workshop keypad log pinged twice. Failed attempts. The digits on the printout were wrong, off by 2 numbers. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I printed the log, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote across the flap, "Workshop log failed entries, 2:14 a.m. 8/5." On August 7th, Lydia handed me something heavier, a hardware store record showing a duplicate key cut on July 10th, paid with Caleb's debit card. Same store I'd used years ago, same fob tag number from an old account that was still linked to his phone wallet. My chest sank. He hadn't broken in, he'd simply cloned the access. I added it to the ledger, my pen trembling. 7/10, duplicate key, $5.25. Charge to Caleb, proof of unauthorized copy. I wanted to drive over that night, pound on his condo door, and demand why. But I heard Grace in my ear, "Anger doesn't hold up in court. Paperwork does." So I sat in the dark and stared at the sealed envelope until the urge passed. The next day, August 8th, I called Asha. She moved fast. By the end of the week, she had filed a notice with the county clerk, my updated power of attorney, my capacity screening, and an affidavit establishing my cognitive baseline on record. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a shield. Now, if anyone tries an ex parte guardianship filing, she said, the court will see your proof first. I visited the bank on August 12th. Hector Ruiz met me in his glass office. "We've flagged your accounts for a fraud alert," he explained. "If anyone tries to add a joint owner or request unusual withdrawals, you'll get notified immediately." He slid an affidavit across the desk. I signed, watching his notary stamp hit the paper like a judge's gavel. Ledger entry 8/12. Bank affidavit filed, fraud alert activated. That evening I invited Caleb to the workshop. The summer heat pressed in through the tin roof. I told him to pick a tool for his projects. He chose a planer, ran his fingers across the handle. For a flicker, he looked like the boy who used to hand me nails while I built porch swings. Then he cleared his throat. "Mara says you like control," he muttered. I set the planer down between us. "I like doors that lock," I said evenly. He didn't laugh. He hugged me, stiff and perfunctory, then walked out with the planer under his arm. After he left, I slid the failed keypad log and duplicate key receipt into a new envelope, signed across the flap, and filed it next to the florist bill and the banquet invoice. The fireproof box was filling faster than I'd ever imagined. That night, the house groaned like it always did in August heat, but I lay awake, hearing phantom clicks at the locks. I thought of Mara's voice on that missent audio file. "If we get a capacity letter, we can, I thought of Delia's boutique, its balloon notes swelling toward December. I thought of Caleb's card swiping at a hardware store for $5.25 that might cost me $53 million. I whispered to the empty room. "You've got your key. I've got my ledger. Let's see who opens which door first." The next morning, I opened my yellow pad to a clean page and wrote in block letters, "Every door tells a story." Beneath it, I listed the locks, the dates, the scratches, the failed entries, and the duplicate. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The locks had spoken. The receipts had testified. And the affidavits were in place. The next move wouldn't be mine. It would be theirs. And when it came, it would arrive not as whispers, but as paperwork shoved through my door. They always push hardest right before the hearing. By the first week of September, I could feel it in my bones. On the morning of September 3rd, I found a thick envelope on my porch. No return address, just my name typed on a label. Inside, a guardianship inquiry packet. Pages of boilerplate language about concerns regarding emerging confusion and need for fiduciary oversight. Not signed, not filed, just a threat disguised as paperwork. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd laid down the banquet invoice months before. The packet smelled of toner and cheap glue. I slipped each sheet into a manila envelope, signed across the flap, and wrote 9/3, guardianship inquiry, unsigned, delivered porch. My hands were steady. My stomach wasn't. That afternoon, Asha filed a preemptive motion. She asked the court to deny any guardianship petition without medical cause and to sanction malicious filings. This isn't SEPT a fight, she said, over the phone. It's SEPT's a chess game, and we just moved our queen. On September 10th, I drove past Delia's boutique. The window display was autumn wreaths covering bare shelves. Inside, I saw her arguing with Mara. Lydia had slipped me a copy of a landlord's 3-day notice dated August 30th, and a new vendor lien filed September 1st. She'd circled the red due date on the balloon note, December 20th. I walked in, bought a scarf I didn't need, and asked about their holiday plans. Delia's smile was brittle. "Oh, we're expanding," she said. Mara's eyes darted like trapped birds. I carried the scarf out, folded in tissue, the receipt tucked into my ledger. By mid-September, I knew the hearing was close. Asha called. We secured a calendar date, October 28. Probate guardianship. That SEP's our battleground. I didn't want to wait that long in silence. So on September 15th, I hosted a chilly night at my house. Invited Caleb, Mara, and, deliberately, Mr. Keene. The air smelled of cumin and cornbread. I set Grace's cedar chest in the corner where everyone could see it. Not hidden, not flaunted. Present. We ate in uneasy quiet. Mara lingered near the chest, her fingers grazing the brass handle. "Beautiful," she said. I nodded. "It holds everything that matters." She tilted her head. "Your retirement plan, just in case." I met her eyes. I built it out of receipts. The line landed heavy. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Keene coughed into his napkin. Mara smiled thinly and walked away. After they left, I wrote in the ledger, 9/15, chilly night. Mara remark about retirement plan, noted. On September 22nd, Caleb texted, "Mom would say let it go." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed back, "Mom would say keep the ledger." He didn't reply. The days crawled. I filled the time with ordinary tasks, fixing a porch rail, mowing the lawn, but my eyes kept flicking to the fireproof box under my bed. Inside were envelopes sealed and signed, banquet invoices, florist bills, locksmith receipts, duplicate key logs, vendor liens, capacity affidavits, each one a brick in a wall. By late September, the wall was tall enough to lean on, but I knew walls don't matter unless you can prove who tried to climb them. On September 30th, Asha called again. "We still make the hearing boring," she promised. "Judges like boring. You still sit, we still present, they still fail." I wanted to believe her, but I knew Mara and Delia weren't done yet. Desperation doesn't stop, it accelerates. So I added one more line to the ledger before turning in for the night, October 28th, court date. Evidence ready, ring appraisal, key receipt, audio transcript, balloon note. I closed the folder, pressed it flat, and whispered to the empty room, "The court will be my dinner table. Let's see how they like the taste." The battleground was chosen. The exhibits were packed. The next act would not be whispers in hallways or scratches on locks. It would be fluorescent lights, sworn oaths, and a judge who would decide whether I was a man in control or a man to be controlled. Fluorescent lights hummed differently in a courthouse. Not the steady kind you get in offices, but a faint flicker, like they're testing whether you'll blink first. On the morning of October 28th, I walked into Fulton County Probate Court with my ledger tucked in a leather folder and a cedar chest key in my pocket. The hallway smelled of coffee burned thin and paper dust. Asha was already there, sharp in her navy suit, files stacked like bricks. Mr. Keene sat on the bench behind us, a silent witness with a postal inspector's memory for detail. Caleb stood with Mara and Delia across the aisle. My son looked pale, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. Mara wore her smile like armor. Dahlia's eyes flicked toward me once, then darted away. When the clerk called the case, we filed into the courtroom. The judge, gray-haired and heavy-browed, adjusted his glasses. Guardianship petition, Whitford, he announced. Mara's attorney began with soft tones. Your Honor, we bring concerns about emerging confusion, financial mismanagement, and potential vulnerability to exploitation. He spoke as if I weren't sitting 10 feet away, as if I were already a shadow in my own life. Asha rose. Your Honor, we submit exhibits that will clarify Mr. Whitford Sipp's position. She slid the first folder forward. Exhibit A, cognitive screening, dated August 2nd, conducted by primary physician, results normal. She placed the signed form where the judge could see the ink still crisp. Exhibit B, bank officer affidavit, notarized July 8th, affirming no liens, liquid reserves intact, and fraud alerts active. She tapped the notary seal with her nail so it caught the light. The judge raised an eyebrow. Go on. Exhibit C, locksmith invoice from June 29th, rekey of primary residence, and a follow-up record, July 10 duplicate key, made with Caleb Whitford Sepp's card. Your Honor, guardians done set usually need duplicate keys behind a man Sepp's back. Mara stiffened, her lips parting. Caleb shifted in his chair, eyes glued to the floor. Exhibit D, audio transcript of a voice memo sent by Mara Whitford on July 20th, in which she says, quote, if we get a capacity letter, we can, The judge leaned forward. Is the recording authentic? Yes, Your Honor, Asha said. Original file preserved with chain of custody, verified by a retired federal inspector seated behind me. Mr. Keene gave a small nod. The judge glanced at him, then back at Mara. Her smile had faltered. Exhibit E, boutique financial documents. Vendor liens, landlord Sipp's late notice, and a balloon note for $699,842 due December 20th under Delia Martin Sipp's business. Motive, Your Honor. Not speculation, records. Delia's face flushed crimson. She whispered sharply to her attorney, who waved her down. Then Asha turned. And finally, Exhibit F, ring appraisal $46,500 dated March 3rd, purchased and provided by Mr. Whitford for his son Sipp's wedding. The same ring Mara displayed on social media while publicly labeling her father-in-law Sipp poor. Silence fell heavy. The judge exhaled through his nose, long and slow. Your response? He asked Mara Sipp's attorney. He stammered, these documents we hadn't seen. That's Sepp's because they didn't look. Asha cut in. They assumed humiliation was the same as evidence. The judge held up a hand. Enough? I've feared enough. He turned his gaze on Caleb. Mr. Whitford, do you have anything to say? Caleb Sipp's throat worked. He looked at me, then at Mara. I thought he was testing me. He said, voice breaking. I wanted to prove I could provide. I didn't think it would go this far. Asha Sipp's voice was firm. By copying keys? By conspiring to question his capacity? Caleb covered his face. Mara whispered something sharp to him, but he didn't answer. The judge adjusted his glasses again. The petition is denied with prejudice. Any future petition will require medical cause and clear and convincing evidence. I am issuing a temporary protective order against interference with Mr. Whitford's residence. Sanctions are reserved, pending further review of boutique liens and any related misrepresentations. He closed the file with a snap. This court values guardianship as a safeguard, not as a weapon. Do not misuse it. Mara's face was pale now, her lipstick too bright against her skin. Delia looked as though the air had been drained from her lungs. Caleb just sat still, hands limp. But Asha wasn't done. She rose one more time. Your Honor, my client has prepared a proposed post-nuptial agreement for his son Caleb Whitford. It preserves Caleb's premarital assets, excludes spousal debts, and honors his late mother's wishes for family protection. It is offered freely, not as a trap. Caleb may sign at any time. The judge nodded. That SIP's not required by this court. but it is noted on the record that sips a father sips mercy, not compulsion. I didn't look at Mara. I didn't look at Delia. I looked at Caleb, my son, and let him see that mercy was still on the table, even after betrayal. When the gavel dropped, the sound wasn't loud, but it was final. Outside the courthouse, Asha touched my shoulder. "Boring enough for you?" she asked, a rare smile tugging at her lips. I shook my head. Justice is never boring. It's just paperwork that finally breathes. I drove home past the oaks, the yellow leaves rattling like brittle receipts in the wind. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Older, harder, but steady. The mask had slipped, not from me, but from them. The court had settled the law, but families don't dissolve in gavels. Fallout would come next. In texts, in vendor lawsuits, in empty shelves where boutiques used to stand. And I would face it with the same weapon that had carried me this far, a ledger that did not lie. After court, everyone pretends nothing happened, until the mail arrives. 3 days after the ruling, a vendor lawsuit landed at Delia's boutique like a brick through glass. Lydia texted me the docket number, and a scan of the complaint, unpaid invoices stretching back to April, totals stacked like loose floorboards. $4,187, $7,960, $11,402. I didn't gloat. I opened my ledger and wrote a single line, 10/31, vendor suit filed ver Delia, confirms motive. Then I set the pen down and let the quiet do what gloating never can. The boutique's display flipped from autumn glow to evergreen dreams almost overnight. Wreaths hung over half-empty shelves. Price tags tucked like apologies. I walked in and stood where I'd bought that scarf in September. The same scent of potpourri tried to be richer than the air it was hiding. Delia was at the register, posture perfect, lipstick perfect, voice perfect. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, as if none of us had stood under fluorescent judgment 4 days earlier. "I'm all set," I said, and tapped the scarf receipt folded in my wallet. Proof is patient. It doesn't need attitude to be true. That weekend, Caleb came by the house carrying the planer he'd borrowed. He set it on my workbench with 2 hands, like it might break if he let it go too fast. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes on the grain. The apology wasn't theatrical. It sounded like a beam settling. "We stood in the workshop breathing sawdust and old summers. I offered you mercy in front of a judge," I said quietly. "I wasn't set performing. The post-nup is still on the table. It guards your premarital assets and keeps you clean from anyone Sep's balloon notes." He swallowed. "Mara says it Sep's a trap." He finally looked up. "Is it?" "It's a boundary," I said. "Mercy with hinges." I slid an envelope across the bench, freshly printed post-nup on top, and beneath it my letter, $150,000 toward a first home, transfer date 12 halves, contingent on his signature. No deadline, no threats. I tapped the line at the bottom. "Your mother would have wanted a roof that didn't leak over your head. That's what this is." He read the first page, then the last, then the offer letter twice. "Mara will hate this," he said. "Then she should sign it the fastest," I said. "Because people who hate boundaries tend to need them most." He laughed once, a small broken thing, then nodded, slid the envelope into his backpack, and hugged me. It wasn't stiff this time. It was a person remembering how to be held. After he left, Mr. Keene swung by with a little box of screws and a suggestion, "Let's upgrade your strike plate." We spent an hour on the threshold installing a deep strike plate and 3-inch screws that drove into studs instead of wishful thinking. I logged it, 11 halves, door reinforced, 3 screws, strike plate, Keene witness. That night, I slept without imagining phantom clicks on my lock. Hector called from the bank on November 5th. "Fraud alert still active," he said. "We'll call you if a joint owner request hits." He paused. "You did good work in there." I thanked him and asked for a copy of the bank affidavit with a timestamp for my files. When the PDF arrived, I printed 2, sealed them in separate envelopes, signed across both flaps. Not paranoia, redundancy. The texts started then, the slow, low thunder you hear before a storm breaks. Mara's chirping turned into clipped sentences. "We need to talk about the post-nup. Then my mom says lawyers prey on families. Then silence. Silence always says more than sentences. On November 12th, Lydia forwarded me the boutique landlord's complaint and a photo of the storefront at closing. Delia behind the counter, counting a till that wouldn't add up to December. Attached was a shaky growth mindset quote. Mara had posted, in black and white. Like quotes can erase math. I slid the printouts into the ledger, 11/12. Landlord suit filed, boutique hours shortened. The house smelled like chili again by mid-month. I was testing recipes for Thanksgiving because cooking steadies me. I boiled cornbread in cast iron, stirred the pot until it went glossy, and heard the front step creak. Caleb stood in the doorway with a notary I recognized from the UPS store. He placed the post-nup on the kitchen table. "I'm signing," he said. "Not to impress you. To protect us." The notary witnessed, stamped, slid the papers back. The sound of the stamp hitting the page was as good as any hymn. I countersigned my letter. $150,000 wire, scheduled 12 halves, memo, first home, mom's wish. He read it again, and exhaled so deep his shoulders fell like he'd set down a rafter. "What about Mara?" I asked. "I asked for marital counseling," he said, "and separate finances. If she wants to sign that, I have to talk to a lawyer." He chewed his lip. "I don't want to blow up my life. I just don't want to drown in someone else's debt." "Boundaries don't blow up lives," I said. "They keep the foundations from cracking." He took a bowl of chili to go and kiss the cedar chest like it was a relic. The door closed behind him with that satisfying click new strike plates make, a sound that means the door and the frame agree about where safety is. On November 20th, Asha and I met to finalize the scholarship clause Grace had drafted years ago, funded from trust earnings, named for her, dormant until Caleb signed his post-nup. It felt right to make generosity conditional on stewardship, not a trap, a template. We signed in blue ink. Asha slid the folder to me. "Justice is a series of boring signatures that stop exciting disasters," she said. I laughed. "Put that on a mug." The boutique limped into Thanksgiving with a Black Friday sign written too big for the glass. Lydia texted me a photo on November 24th. Lights off at noon, door locked, a handwritten note. "Due to unforeseen circumstances." Circumstances have names, they're spelled with dollar signs. I wrote a letter to the judge's clerk that day. Old-fashioned, on good paper. Not to brag, to say thank you. Your time and clarity protected an old man's rights. I signed it with a pen that had heft and slid it into the outgoing tray. Some institutions deserve to be told when they mattered. Thanksgiving came soft and cool. I set 2 extra plates, one for Grace, one for whatever future we'd earned. The turkey smelled like butter and thyme. The cornbread came out with edges like gold coins. Caleb showed up early, sleeves rolled, eyes easier than I'd seen them in months. He took the carving knife like a man who knows exactly where the joints are. We ate, we breathed, we let silence mean peace for once. Before dessert, I raised my glass. Not like a gavel, like an invitation. "Money didn't save me," I said. "Paperwork did. Boundaries did." Caleb smiled without shame. Mr. Keene toasted with sparkling water. The room felt the way a house feels after you square a frame that's been leaning too long. Nothing flashy, everything plumb. After they left, I stacked plates in the sink and stood at the window, watching the streetlight turn the oak leaves into coins again. I wrote one last ledger note for the night. 11/27, post-nup signed. $150,000 wire queued 12 halves. Scholarship clause executed. Door holds. Then I slid the ledger back into the fireproof box and locked it. Fallout hadn't ended. It rarely does neatly. But justice had begun to take root in the boring places, calendars, memos, transfer dates, clauses that live in the quiet of file drawers. That's where salvation hides for men like me. Not in speeches, in signatures. The next week would deliver what paperwork promises: a wire transfer with my wife's name on the memo line, consequences landing where they belong, and a decision from my son that would either seal our repairs or start the demolition of a marriage built on borrowed shine. Justice doesn't sound like trumpets. It sounds like a wire transfer clearing at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. On November 20th, I met Asha in her office. We finalized the scholarship clause Grace had drafted years earlier, her handwriting still visible in the margins of the old trust notes. The clause earmarked part of the trust's annual earnings to fund trade school scholarships, activated only after Caleb signed his post-nup. Asha pushed the folder across the table with a smile. Positive leverage, she said. Your wife knew what she was doing. 4 days later, November 24, Caleb arrived at my house with a notary from the UPS store. He set the envelope on my kitchen table like it weighed 100 pounds. The notary's stamp hit the paper with a satisfying thunk, and for the first time in months, I felt the floor beneath me steady. Caleb signed. I countersigned. Then I pulled out my letter of transfer, $150,000, wire scheduled for December 2nd, memo line. First home, mom's wish. He read it twice. His shoulders dropped, relief pouring out of him like a man setting down lumber after a long climb. You really wired it already? He asked. Scheduled, I said. I keep my word even when others don deceit. We hugged. Different this time. Not stiff, not guilty, just real. That night, while Caleb carried his copy of the post-nup back to his car, Dahlia's balloon note expired. Lydia texted me a photo of the boutique windows papered over, closed signs hanging crooked, wreaths stacked in a corner like unsold promises. Motive doesn't need an obituary. It writes itself in foreclosure fonts. Mara posted a cryptic black and white photo on Instagram. New beginnings are the hardest but the most necessary. No mention of court, no mention of liens. Just a caption vague enough for her friends to call her brave. Caleb, meanwhile, called me the next day. I told her we sit you're doing marital counseling, he said, and we sit you're separating finances. If she won sit agree, I sit you'll file for annulment or divorce. I sit you're not drowning in her debts. I didn't stet cheer. I didn't stet scold. I just said, good. A house with no foundation collapses. On Thanksgiving, I set 2 extra plates again, Grace's chair and the chair for a future not yet built. Before we ate, I lifted my glass. This time, my words weren't for show. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening from. Caleb laughed. Mr. Keene chuckled, shaking his head. I grinned and added, kidding. Here sips the real toast. Money didn't save me. Paperwork did. Boundaries did. The chili I'd made weeks earlier had been warm comfort, but this turkey, this table, this was justice. Not the courtroom kind, though that mattered. The family kind, the ledger kind. After dessert, Caleb stayed behind while Keene washed dishes. He opened the cedar chest for the first time in years. Grace's letters, the trust binder, the Polaroids of him as a boy. He pulled out the photo of the birdhouse he built at 10. Wood splitting but nails true. You kept everything, he said. I keep receipts, I told him. He tucked the photo into his pocket. Then I said'll keep this one. That night, after they left, I sat with the fireproof box and updated the ledger. 11/20ths, scholarship clause executed. 11/24ths, post-nup signed, notarized. 12 $150 transfer scheduled. 11/24 boutique shuttered, Delia defaulted. 11/25ths, Caleb agrees to counseling plus separate finances. I closed the folder and whispered to the house. Justice is boring, and that sips why it lasts. Because justice isn't loud, it doesn't demand applause. It's a judge's ruling that won't be overturned. It's a wire transfer clearing when it should. It's a son choosing boundaries over shame. The boutique collapsed, the balloon popped, and Mara's captions turned into whispers of pity. My name was never tagged, never spoken. But in my house, at my table, my ledger proved what mattered. I hadn't been poor. I had been patient. And patience, written down and notarized, always pays. With the court behind me, and the transfer ahead, reflection became the next chapter. Wealth isn't the balance of an account. It's the instructions you leave your future self, and the proof you guard so no one else writes over it. Wealth isn't just numbers in a trust. It's a set of instructions for your future self. I learned that in the quiet weeks after Thanksgiving, when the rain turned Atlanta's streets into mirrors. I drove past Delia's shuttered boutique on December 3rd. The windows were papered over, the closed sign still hanging crooked. A wreath leaned sideways, one last remnant of evergreen dreams. I parked for a moment, watching the rain blur the glass, and whispered a prayer, not for them to recover but for me to remember. Borrowed money, borrowed image, borrowed strength. They all collapse when the note comes due. Back home, I opened the fireproof box. I laid out the envelopes in order, like stepping stones across a river: banquet invoice, florist bill, locksmith receipt, duplicate key log, audio transcript, bank affidavit, post-nup, notary stamp, each one signed across the flap, each one sealed with dates that couldn't be argued. I didn't keep them for revenge anymore. I kept them as a record of who I had been while they tried to rewrite me. The ledger felt heavier now. I flipped to the last page and wrote a full update. Keys accounted for, locks replaced, strike plate reinforced, POA updated and filed with court. Capacity baseline documented, August 2nd. Post-nup signed, November 24th. $150,000 transfer cleared, December 2nd. Scholarship clause notarized, November 20th. First award scheduled for spring semester. Evidence envelopes sealed, filed, intact. I ran my hand down the page. Proof of a life protected isn't glamorous, but it's grounding. That weekend, Caleb texted me a photo of a starter home in Decatur, porch sagging, paint peeling, gutters hanging like loose threads. Thinking of fixing it up, he wrote. I smiled. My son finally wanted to build something with his hands again. I sent him a list of lumber yards and a dad joke about nails. He sent back a laughing emoji, the first in months. On December 7th, I walked to Grace's dogwood tree behind the house. I poured coffee into the mug she used to love, set it at the base, and read her the ledger out loud like scripture. We did it right, I whispered. No shouting, no breaking laws, just paperwork stacked higher than their lies. The wind rattled the last leaves, and for a moment I could almost hear her laugh in the branches. At night, I dreamed less about court and more about building, Caleb hammering boards, Grace planting flowers, the cedar chests standing open in the corner of the workshop. Justice doesn't erase scars, but it makes them part of the story instead of the ending. I thought often about that word Mara had thrown at me in June. Poor. I had worn it like a shackle for weeks, until I realized it had never been mine to carry. I was poor in patience for a moment, poor in courage for a week, but never poor in proof, never poor in legacy. One line kept circling back, one truth I wanted to leave behind louder than any insult. You didn't lose me, you gave me away. Mara and Delia gave me away the night they laughed about guardianship letters and copied my keys. Caleb nearly gave me away by silence, but he found his way back. And I gave myself back to Grace's memory by choosing law, order, and ledgers over rage. The city glistened that month, every rain puddle catching neon lights like coins. I drove slow, letting the rhythm of the windshield wipers match the steady tick of a life rebuilt. December in Atlanta smelled like wet pine and new asphalt, and I told myself that even seasons wash themselves clean eventually. But stories don't stop at reflection. Aftermath always arrives: phone calls at night, divorce papers, stray apologies that show up too late. And I would face those too with the same weapon that saved me from their laughter, a ledger that never lies. The call came on a gray Monday morning, December 10th. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter while I was marking a ledger line for the scholarship transfer. Caleb's voice was tired but clear. She won't sign the separate finances agreement, he said. She wants a brand pivot, not a marriage. His words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. 2 days later, December 12, he filed for divorce. No shouting, no mess, just paperwork. Asha referred him to a colleague who handled family law clean, fast, without mudslinging. I didn't celebrate. Divorce isn't a victory dance, it's demolition done carefully, so the next house can be built. That night, I wired the $150,000 anyway. A promise is a promise. On the memo line, first home, mom's wish. The bank slip printed with the cleared transfer on December 13th. I folded it neatly and logged it 12/13. Transfer cleared, commitment honored despite divorce filing. The following week, Delia asked for a meeting. She didn't come to my house. She asked to meet at a mediator's office downtown. The room smelled of stale coffee and copier toner. She refused to sit across from me, so she stood, arms crossed, the way you'd stand in line at a bank you knew couldn't cash your check. I set the scarf I'd bought from her boutique on the table, folded perfectly in its tissue paper. "This belongs to you," I said. Her eyes filled. She shook her head. "We thought you were an ATM," she whispered. "I thought if Mara secured you, the boutique would survive." I didn't set gloat. I didn't set scold. I slid a card across the table instead. "Contact information for a small business clinic that helps restructure debts. Take it," I said. "Or don't set. But don't set call what you did love. Call it survival. At least then it sets honest." She left the scarf behind. I sealed it in an envelope and wrote 12/16. Scarf returned, refused by Delia. The ledger doesn't care about shame, only facts. 2 days later, December 18, Asha called, irritation sharp in her voice. "Someone filed a bar complaint against me. Anonymous. Accuses me of predatory influence over an elderly client. I didn't have to ask who. Complaints don't spring from thin air. They spring from desperation." Within hours the complaint died, sloppy, unsigned, no evidence. But it left a stain of intent. Asha laughed, but it was the dry laugh of someone who has had to fight smoke with paper for too long. The next morning I drove to a stationery shop in Decatur, bought a fountain pen with a weighty barrel and a dark blue nib. I mailed it to her office with a note. "For filings that outlive rumors." When she texted me a photo of the pen resting on her desk, I wrote one last December line in my ledger, 12/19, bar complaint dismissed. Pen gifted to Asha. By Christmas my house was quiet again. Quiet in a way that didn't ache. Caleb came by with paperwork for the house he was buying. Peeling paint, sagging porch, gutters hanging like tired arms. I helped him sketch a plan for repairs on the back of an old invoice. He laughed, just once, and it sounded like wood snapping in a clean cut. Mara didn't call, Delia didn't write. Silence can be punishment, but in my case, it was mercy. Still, I wanted one last word, not in court, not in anger, but in irony. The word they had thrown at me in June would be the word I'd hang in my workshop before the year was out, and I would make it mine. On the afternoon of December 23rd, I stood in my workshop holding a brass plate the size of a paperback. I'd had it engraved at a little shop off Peachtree. The word on it was simple, 4 letters that had once been spit at me like venom poor. I screwed it into the wall above the workbench, where my ledger usually sat, not as a wound, but as a banner. Then I stepped back and whispered what the letters stood for now. Patient, orderly, on record, responsible. My definition, not theirs. Caleb came by that evening, carrying lasagna in a foil tray. Mr. Keene brought pound cake. We ate by the glow of the cedar chest in the corner, one chair left empty for Grace. After dessert, I tapped the brass plate. "You see this?" I asked. Caleb read it aloud, frowning. "Poor, reclaimed," I said. "This isn't the insult she threw at me. This is the truth that saved me." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening in the Christmas lights. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. Outside, neighbors' lights blinked red and green, but inside, it was just us. No mockery, no whispers about capacity letters, no scratches on locks. Just steady breathing, steady proof. On December 26th, an email pinged my phone. The first scholarship check had cleared. A trade school student named Jordan would start in January. Tuition covered in Grace's name. I printed the email, slid it into an envelope, and wrote 12/26. Scholarship funded, Jordan S. Grace's clause activated. That same night, I drove past a little house in Decatur. Sagging porch, peeling paint, gutters, waiting to be reset. Caleb had sent me a photo, but seeing it in person made me smile. I pictured him out there with a hammer in spring, sweat on his forehead, nails lined up like soldiers, building again, not pretending. Back in the workshop, I opened the cedar chest. Grace's letters rested in neat bundles. I laid my yellow ledger inside, thick with pages, signed flaps, and taped drives. It belonged with her now, not because the fight was over, but because it was part of the legacy she asked me to guard. I closed the lid gently, ran my hand across the cedar grain, and let out a breath that felt 10 years old. The irony was complete. They had tried to make me look like a man with nothing. Instead, I had shown them that wealth isn't applause or boutiques or borrowed debt. Wealth is discipline. Wealth is patience. Wealth is boundaries written down so clearly they survive the storm. When the year ended, I hung one more line above the brass plate. A line for me, for Caleb, for anyone listening to this story. In the end, I didn't prove I was rich. I proved I was the only one who knew what wealth was for. And with that, I turned off the lights, one switch at a time, until the house stood dark and quiet. A home defended, not by fists or fury, but by the boring strength of envelopes and signatures.